Hi there, everybody. Welcome to today's Art of Procurement Industry webinar. My name is Kelly Barner, and I'm going to be your host for today's session. Now, before I start telling you about today's topic, and of course, the guests that we're going to welcome, I want to cover a couple of quick housekeeping things. If you've been to any kind of Art of Procurement webinar or virtual event before, you will know that this is entirely discussion-based. And so you have an important job today, just like I do and just like our guests do. Up the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see that there's both a chat and a Q&A. I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go through the conversation. So unlike slide-driven webinars, we're not going to save a few minutes for questions at the end. I will be watching that the entire time, and your comments and questions are both welcome, and I'll pose those to our guests as we go along. The other thing that you will see down at the bottom is a little happy face emoji button. All positive emotions, but if you prefer to sort of signal your response to what we're talking about, instead of putting in comments and questions, you can explore those emojis and let the speakers know that you're engaged in the conversation. All right, without further ado, let me tell you about where we're going to focus today. So our main topic is Chief Procurement Officer Insights on Procurement Value Orchestration. And the core of our discussion is going to be based on recent research run by Deloitte that involved 350 senior procurement leaders across 40 countries around the world. The goal was to uncover the key attributes and capabilities possessed by the most successful procurement teams. That's who we're calling these orchestrators of value. And so the goal today will be to discuss the survey findings and find out more about these orchestrators of value and how all of us can emulate what they do best. Now, to help me do that, I'm going to bring two guests on screen in just a moment. I'm going to be joined by Joe Chmielewski. He's the Managing Director at Deloitte Consulting, and Vishal Patel, who is the VP of Product Marketing at Ivalua. So let me bring Joe and Vishal both in.
Good morning and good afternoon.
Hi, Joe. Hi, Vishal. Thank you both so much for being with me.
Hello. How are you guys?
All right. Now, before we do our standard intro, we were joking backstage beforehand. Vishal, let me be the first person in this event to tell you, I love your shirt about loving procurement. We know from past experience, we're going to get a lot of comments about Vishal's shirt. So if we could just have sort of a collective moment of group appreciation for what you've chosen to wear. Love the procurement positive emotion gear. But Joe, a lot of our audience members are probably meeting you for the first time. So I want to take you through sort of our standard intro question. Philip Eidson uses this in all of the Art of Procurement podcasts. Did you find procurement, or did procurement find you?
Well, thank you, Kelly, and Art of Procurement, and thank you to Vishal and Ivalua. And procurement definitely found me. I've always really personally been fascinated by highly strategic and highly complex problems and challenges to solve. And what I've really come to appreciate is that, procurement sits at the intersection of constantly evolving stakeholder needs and constantly innovating markets and dynamic markets. And I think by definition, that means that it meets the bar of strategic and complex client situations. And the thing for me, and I think for many in the rest of the world, is that folks haven't really always appreciated that fact. But, with the rise of COVID, geographic uncertainty, the rise of ESG, generative AI, the world has now become, as one of my clients recently told me, a case where sourcing is all of a sudden sexy.
Well, I don't know. Maybe your client is just figuring that out. I think most of us that have been in the space for a while have considered it sexy since the very beginning. But I love the fact that people outside of the procurement space, or maybe that are more recent additions to the profession, are discovering how exciting it is. And you're absolutely right, Joe. All of these different dynamics we have going on in companies, procurement, whether through sourcing or risk or suppliers, kind of has a hand in all of it. Now, Vishal, we've had the pleasure of welcoming you to a number of these events over the years. So I'm going to give you a slightly different intro question. We're going to be talking a lot today about orchestrators of value. And I think there's going to be a lot of focus on orchestration. But I also want to acknowledge that the meaning of the word value can be a little bit different person by person and team by team. So based on your conversations, what do you typically find procurement professionals mean when they talk about value?
Yeah, that sounds like a simple question, but I think it's a little bit of a difficult one because I think it depends very much on who you're communicating with, right? So, are you communicating with your business or your supplier community? Are you a mature procurement organization? Are you sort of starting off? What's the perception of procurement in your organization? So I think that word highly depends on the situation in which your procurement group is functioning. For example, I know from the Deloitte report, Orchestrators of Value, they can talk about value in much more of a strategic perspective, right? So value as in innovation, in risk, in sustainability, but also not forgetting about cost, because you don't get to talk about those other things if you don't do the basic stuff, right? So I think that's it really depends on the context in which you're trying to communicate that, I think.
Yeah. Now, to that point about the research, and we've kind of mentioned it a couple of times, but before we start discussing it, Joe, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about it a little bit. So we know that there were a large number of executive level participants. We know that the findings are global in nature. But what else do you find it's helpful for us to know as context or background information about the study as a whole before we dig in and start talking about some of what it has to teach us?
Yeah, Kelly, I think you actually did a tremendous intro of the survey itself, but I'll just add a couple of additional pieces. It is an annual survey that we perform. We do look at global respondents with several hundred respondents, which we're thrilled to have. One of the key takeaways that we had was really looking at this concept of orchestrators of value. The organizations that stood out in terms of defining and creating significant and above average value, and also engaging in activities that we consider to be orchestrator type of activities. And if you look at the data, what you find is a strong positive correlation between those that perform orchestrator activities and that are able to deliver the most significant value for their teams. And I'm sure we'll probably spend a lot of time today digging into more of the specifics. That's really where we kind of started.
Yeah. Can you give us any high-level teases about some of the things that these orchestrators of value are truly doing differently? I appreciate the fact that you talked about correlation. So it's not necessarily that doing one specific thing instantly makes you a leader. Clearly, it's a combination of skills and priorities and approaches. But what are a few things that make these orchestrators different?
Yeah. Well, I'd say three things really stood out for us. One is in the area of digitization, where organizations are, orchestrators of value are investing, on average about 10% more in digital technologies than other organizations. The second is what we call agility. So orchestrators that demonstrate agility are 1.5 times more likely to have hybrid work models. They're 2 times more likely to have self-reported agile teams. They're 20% more likely to be doing things like just having standard and standardly applied processes, which is sort of performing that base that allows the organizations and the teams to then be more flexible with their stakeholders. And the third is talent, where orchestrators of value are really demonstrating a significant difference in terms of their investment and retention of talent. And that's been a huge and persistent and growing gap that we've seen over the course of several years.
Yeah. I think what's interesting to me and most hopeful, Joe, about what you shared is that some of what makes you a leader is just doing the basic things well consistently at scale. I think it doesn't necessarily make you an orchestrator of value, but it opens the door to that opportunity. And most of us can do that if we just focus in that area. Vishal, based on your reading of the research and of course what Joe just shared, what's most compelling or appealing to you about these orchestrators of value?
Yeah, so I share this, agree with what Joe said. Those are clearly important areas. I pulled out a couple of things that are kind of a level down, I guess. So one was, if we talk about technology specifically, it was really interesting to see that the orchestrators of value had a high degree of, or at least placed a high degree of importance on the flexibility of the technology that they do use. And I think that that comes with a maturing procurement organization. And as you mature, and sometimes even in the beginning, you really you get to a point where you have refined your processes, you've refined your engagement models, your operating models, and you really want technology that can support that, versus what has been the norm in the past is you buy off the shelf software and fit everything to it. But I think as you mature and become a more mature procurement organization, you need more of that agility and flexibility. So that's one part. The second part on the technology piece was the importance and focus on data quality. And that was really nice to see, because there was a focus on quality of data, but also the ability to sync data across all the different processes, right? So if you're thinking about source to pay, you have to be able to look across the full process with as little effort as possible, and not focus on, entering data from one place to another, or focus on integrating data. You really need to focus your time and effort on pulling the insights from the data that's available across the process. And then the third was actually more of a functional focus area, which it seemed like this group focused or put a big emphasis on supplier relationship management. And I think that often gets overlooked as an area of focus, because people are trying to do specific things like sourcing or contracts or procure to pay. But I think like the supplier relationship, supplier management part, it really is a foundation for all of the other things, and can really double, triple the value you get out of everything else if you do that foundation bit really well. So those were the three things I kind of pulled out of it.
Yeah. Joe, a couple of the things that Vishal just talked about, I'd be interested to get your perspective on. One is certainly the role that digital investments and implementation and integration, of course, play in anyone's ability to become an orchestrator of value, but also in a non-digital sense, commenting on that relationship aspect specifically around suppliers. It's interesting that two things that seem like completely different areas of focus and even completely different skill sets would need to come together so well in order to achieve this leadership level. So be interested about your additional thoughts on those 2 points.
Yeah, and Kelly, in fact, what we're seeing is that there actually is a really strong correlation between those two areas. A lot of times I think it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking about technology investments in and of their own sake, and to at times maybe lose focus of the value that those technologies provide to the organization. And one of the things that we see as a hallmark of orchestrators of value is that these teams are utilizing the vast amounts of data that they have to actually create knowledge for the organization. And when you're coming to your stakeholders with knowledge, with insights on how you spend, and with insights on how the supply market is moving, with insights on how your suppliers are performing, very often that's what earns you the seat at the table to become a real partner to the business. And so these two things, I think, are inextricably intertwined, in fact.
Yeah. Now, as we talk about that, clearly the talent, and that's one of the things you listed off, Joe, talent investment is incredibly important. When we think about this balance of relationship building and leveraging digital capabilities, what type of skills or talent investment are these orchestrators of value making? And maybe what I'll do with this, Joe, let me stay with you, and then Vishal, I'll get your thoughts on the same point. But Where do you see these teams focusing their talent and skills investments?
Well, we are seeing orchestrators of value invest on every dimension of talent more than non-orchestrators of value. The biggest gap that we are seeing is digital skills. So it's 42% of CPOs identified this need. Orchestrators of value are closing that gap more, but still perceive digital skills to be significant. The other area, per what we just talked about, is we are seeing a tremendous realization that the kind of soft skills are absolutely needed to become an effective procurement partner with the business. The kind of ability to frame up problems, to utilize data, to create a compelling case to make change, to create coalitions that drive a different way of managing spend in the first place, and even for just advocating for sourcing and procurement to play the role that they need to play. One of my clients talked about sourcing and procurement sort of being the productive grit in the wheels of the machine, where you got to have that sort of courage to be able to face the business and productively challenge the business. But in order to do that effectively, you got to have the skills to be able to make that happen.
Yeah, no, you do. And Vishal, that's really interesting because we've talked about soft skills in procurement for a long time, and it's usually around influencing, active listening, communication skills, negotiation, maybe project management you would include in that list. But the idea that courage and grit belong in the procurement soft skills toolkit today is sort of a new idea to me. Maybe it's something that's spinning out of the last couple of years where things were a little bit harder. Interested to see if that aligns with what you're hearing and seeing around talent investment and what it might signify for procurement as a profession, that grit is becoming so key to our being able to deliver that value.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you say that, I think that that's probably what even attract people to procurement in some cases, because you really have to be someone that does get involved or want to get involved in many areas of the business, right? Like, so it's not only negotiating with suppliers and trying to negotiate contracts, right? Like you have to interface with and collaborate with so many other parts of a business. And it's interesting. So we did this love procurement thing, and for many years we've asked people like, why do you love procurement? Because I do firmly believe like people in procurement actually do love what they're doing. And we asked people why they love it, and a big common answer was that we get to interact with and collaborate with many different parts of the organization, right? So it's very different from being in different other functions where if you're in IT, it's sort of a limited role. If you're in HR, it's kind of limited, but in procurement, you're like, you're dealing with marketing, but at the same time, you're dealing with HR and IT and all sorts. So I think that comes with the territory a bit. But when it comes to talent development, I think things are moving really quickly, and procurement organizations need to try to bridge the gap because, we're talking about analytics and needing people to be able to handle analytics and data and massive quantities of data, but very quickly you'll need to be able to deal with generative AI and have prompt engineering skill sets in procurement. So that's a whole new other area, not as complicated maybe, and maybe faster to catch up with, but definitely an area that will come out in the next couple of years as a skill that people in procurement need. So there's a bit of catch up to do, I think.
Well, one of the other things I feel like we should acknowledge up front before we move on and start talking about some of the, ESG sort of related things that came out in the study is that it would be easy to think of value as the stuff procurement delivers after the savings have been checked off. But in fact, the study revealed that savings are a top priority, even for orchestrators of value. So it's not that they're saying, no, we've so proven our worth, we don't even have to think about savings. We just do all this other stuff, and finance never comes and asks us how things are going. Joe, is there anything interesting about either how orchestrators of value deliver savings, or how they communicate about it, or how they position relative to it, where we might notice some differences in the way other teams and organizations think about and deliver savings?
Absolutely. What we're seeing for orchestrators of value is that they have a more robust and broader definition of the value levers that they can be pulling. And they have the permission from the business. They've earned the permission from the business to move further up into the decision-making process to drive even more influence. So many times organizations will conceive of a sourcing and procurement team as really, the folks that go out, beat up suppliers, take down the rate that you pay per item. Yeah. And that is the lever that you get to pull. We are seeing a lot of organizations now empowering their sourcing teams to think about things like challenging the business. Do we need to buy this in the first place? Challenging specifications in a productive manner, right? Bringing insights that help understand maybe we can buy this thing fundamentally differently. Aggregating spend, right? Are we buying in silos or thinking about things purely on a contract by contract basis, rather than as an aggregated amount of spend that pulls the full enterprise buying power to market? And then thinking on the back end, how do we ensure that after all this hard work, we're actually buying off of the agreements that we purchase and driving compliance to those agreements? So when you're able to pull all of those levers, and you have the relationship with the business that trusts that you'll do that effectively, that's where you really see above average value created.
And that's interesting, Vishal, because that very much connects to what you were saying about procurement not being as siloed as some other functions in the company are, that it's not just about us sort of having a hand in all these different pots, but it's about the credibility that we build and the relationships that we form and the access to information and the types of decisions that are being made. Was there anything on the savings topic that jumped out at you from the research findings?
Yeah, I mean, clearly savings it's not going to go away, right? It's not one of those things that's going to one day stop being important to procurement. It's part of the package, right? So, but I think the way you get your business partners to think about the value can be changed. For example, we have customers that are being pushed to do a lot more on sustainability, right? So we need to, but there's this assumption that sustainability equals expensive.
Yeah,
that's not always the case. But you also need to connect the dots as to if you make this product more sustainable, it's going to lead to more sales and more margin or more new markets or whatever that is. But only procurement can kind of connect those dots. And others can do it too, but procurement for sure should be able to connect those dots. So it's also about, I think, communicating the trade-offs, right? So yes, you can save this much money, but if you bought it for a little bit more, this is the other outcome that you can also get as well.
Yeah. Well, and then let's stay with that, Joe. Let's start talking about sustainability, because I also see we have a question from Jeremy about that in the chat. What observations or learnings can you share around the role that orchestrators of value are playing in the overall ESG initiatives at their companies?
Yeah, and Kelly, I'm thrilled on a personal level to be able to talk about this subject. What brought me actually into the professional world was a desire to really focus on
and I think Joe may have. Oh, there we go. Sorry, Joe, we lost you for just a second there.
Oh, of course. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, it is thrilling to me to see that ESG is the second highest priority noted by CPOs in our survey. And that is a massive shift over the course of even the last 2 years. And not surprisingly, we are seeing that orchestrators are doing more when it comes to ESG related topics. They are 3 times more likely to have a mature supplier diversity program. They're 1.5 to 2 times more likely to have a net zero commitment. And they're almost 5 times more likely to be in a position where they're spending 3% or more of procurement budgets on ESG. So in general, we are seeing, again, that correlation between ESG outcomes and orchestrators of value.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting, Vishal, because certainly a lot of us, I think, shared Joe's passion and excitement for these other areas of contribution that procurement can make. But what he didn't point out is that procurement is being driven to do this by regulation necessarily, by customer demand, although we know that's all part of it, that it's an opportunity to focus our energies around a very specific type of value that allows our work to be more purpose-driven. What are some of the things that you're seeing and hearing about how other procurement teams are personally connecting with this opportunity to create this specific kind of value? And even maybe how it's starting to change the way we do the other parts of our work?
Yeah, so lots of thoughts on this specific topic. As a company, as Ivalua, we've definitely done a lot in this area. We think our biggest contribution is actually what we can actually embed in our own procurement technology offering.
Yeah.
But there's a few different things over here. So one, regulation. I think regulation is going to come, and it's going to come fast, and it will force the hand of many if you're not already doing it, right? So if you're not already doing it, one day your CFO will come and say, I need to do this reporting, so you need to do something about it. So, in that way, you have to get ahead of the game, I think. And it's already happened in Europe. It's coming in the US, as we've seen with the California Act. And it affects a lot of companies. It's, I think, estimated like 40 to 50,000 companies. The European regulations matter still if you're an American company that has operations there. So it's impacting everybody, regulations. The other thing is, I think it's starting to change a little bit of how functions in procurement. So we've started to notice interesting titles pop up as job requirements. So, supplier carbon manager, for example, was an interesting one that came up with one of our customers. And, in the same way you have procurement analyze spend and look for opportunities, we definitely think that it's following the same trend, right? Like you analyze carbon emissions of what you're buying, and you uncover opportunities to reduce that. So it's a different type of savings if you want to stick to that. But I think there's a lot of parallels in the actions you do there and what you do in emissions. And there's, it's starting to be more standardized as to how you measure and monitor and sort of track those things. But I think that's definitely one where, if it's not clear in your organization who is driving the bus on doing this thing, especially Scope 3 emissions, which is a big deal. There's obviously much, also similar big deals with child labor and modern slavery, and those are all important. But the one that's sort of most gray, I guess, is the Scope 3 emissions. And I think that's one where procurement can really take the organization into the right direction, just because of the relationship with suppliers and the spend that's related to it. So those are some thoughts on that. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting as you talk about all of this work that's going on. And I think it's particularly exciting to hear about these new titles, both because that suggests to me procurement understands how critical this is, but it's also a commitment on the part of these organizations to put that experience within procurement. Do we have the skills and the tools that we need today to execute against some of these things, like, as you said, whether it's Scope 3 emissions or concerns around modern slavery in the supply chain? Does this bring us back to that talent topic and look at maybe a place where we should be focusing our talent and skills investment?
I think it brings us back to talent, and it brings us back to technology tools. Right now, I would characterize what many of the discussions we're having on this topic is a lot of excitement and a lot of confusion, and quite honestly, a certain level of anxiety that the CPO and the sourcing organization is being expected to enable a really tremendous area for the business, and yet we have not seen, in many cases, a concurrent investment in the knowledge, the training, the tools that organizations ultimately need to be successful in these areas. If you want to tackle, as Vishal mentioned, the idea of modern slavery, or you want to ensure compliance, you need the ability to look deep within your supply chain, and not just your tier 1 suppliers, but your end tier suppliers, to understand what activities are they performing, where are they located, how are they operating. A lot of times organizations just don't have the tool set to make that happen. Similarly with scope 3 emissions. Yes, many procurement organizations are in the exciting position of influencing scope 3 emissions, but yet many of them don't yet have the tools and even the processes in place that allow for consistency of measurement, consistency of reporting, and easy access to that data or enterprise-wide.
Yeah, I'd also add, if I can, so I think a lot of it also has to do with where procurement is focused, or what influence procurement has, right? So, for example, if it's just indirect spend, that leaves a big chunk, potentially, depending on your industry, a big chunk of spend categories that are just maybe untouched or fall outside of procurement, right? Like direct materials, of course. So as Ivalua, we see our customers kind of bringing those two together. But we also see customers that are very, very much ahead of the game. So companies like IKEA that are able to track, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, but it's the influence, it's the brand that IKEA has. They can do that, right? Like not every company can do that.
Right.
If you want to work with IKEA, you need to do XYZ. Not every company can do that. So there's a little bit of that in play as well, I think.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because, Joe, I wrote down as you were saying it, if I were going to describe what it's like to work in procurement, especially today, I would in fact say it's exciting, confusing, and sometimes anxiety creating. But that is where a lot of these opportunities come from. And Vishal, one question for you on this, and then I actually see a question I'm going to hit in the chat. You talked about the fact that something being sustainable or environmentally responsible does not necessarily make it more expensive, but adding that to a project's objectives may make the decision-making process more complex because you're adding in additional constraints and sources of information, even people that have different drivers for their decisions. I think it's a perfect way to connect sort of how Joe characterized this with, truthfully, the job procurement is doing day in and day out. How do we handle all of these different requirements and yet still do as good of a job facilitating business decisions and driving desired outcomes as we did when it was just, okay, leveraged volume drives savings? How can we make sure we're still providing the information and the frameworks, frankly, to help the business make decisions that take all of these other things into account?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that it's easy. It's a tough thing to do for sure. But I do think that there are, as Joe has said, right, like it's about providing or creating that knowledge, right? So if you are able to present that data at the right moment, then it will have an impact, right? So if you're deciding on something to purchase, or which supplier to involve in a sourcing event, or which supplier to do more business with, because ultimately, I think the sustainability topic also comes down to how high is it priority-wise for your organization, and how are you able to flow that down to suppliers, right? Because I'll tell you, we have a customer in the construction industry, and construction is being hit very hard by sustainability requirements, and they've just had a tough time having enough supply of the sustainable materials that they do want to purchase. So they've actually collaborated with their competitors to create more demand for the things that they want to buy from their suppliers, so that supplier can stay in business, right? So I think it's thinking about also much longer term objectives, working on those strategies together with business and suppliers. But yeah, you can't, obviously, it may take away from something else that you're focused on, right? And you can't ever do everything all the time. So I think it's gonna have to be prioritized.
Yeah.
If I might just add to that, I think that's a really tremendous point, Vishal. And, we're sort of seeing, I'd say, two tracks. There's kind of track one where, maybe you're buying the traditional things that you bought before. But the challenge is, how do you gather additional information about the environmental impact of those goods or services that you were buying, right? And a lot of that is a kind of data gathering, challenge that can be enabled really quite effectively with the right technology. There's another thread, which is buying net new goods and services that are sustainable goods and services.
Right.
And there you have the additional challenge of really managing a new category effectively. And, that means asking people who are, category managers, if, let's say you have a vehicle program, right? Now those individuals have to rapidly get smart on the world of electric vehicles, which is not the same as just replacing one for one a traditional vehicle with an EV vehicle. There's a whole ecosystem of parts and service and electricity needs and infrastructure needs that come with that. Same thing if you want to engage in the purchasing of carbon commodities, right? That's a whole financial category of management. And so it adds the challenge of raising the bar on your category managers and getting smart about really whole new categories of goods and services to buy.
I actually think that's a great both call out and also sort of tie into what Jason's asking. We've talked about tech, we've talked about talent. What we haven't discussed as much is process. And when you think about, regardless of what type of initiative it is inside of that ESG umbrella, obviously these orchestrators of value have to have not only good processes, but processes that can change as the supply markets change, as company priorities change. Anything that you wanted to offer up, either about process generally, Joe, or that ties what orchestrators of value are doing around process to what we've been discussing in the area of ESG?
So many times when we look at organizations that are performing above average, or, the flip side, organizations that are maybe struggling, if you look at both of those organizations, most likely both of those organizations have very robustly written policies. They have documented processes. They probably have a 6 or 7 step sourcing process. They probably have a very highly articulated, policy on buying and compliance.
Yeah.
But the biggest difference is the ability and permission to rigorously follow those processes and policies. So it's not like we're seeing that there's some magic new level of process and policy, but really rather the ability to actually engage in those fundamental building blocks, to run them for organizations, to not have, for example, pressure from the business to skip steps 2 and 3, or maybe to indicate that the process was followed, even if a stakeholder is bringing them a contract ready to sign that the procurement team wasn't involved in.
Yeah.
So it's it's the involvement, and it's the kind of the hand-to-hand combat of actually following those processes and policies. Yeah. That's often a differentiator.
Now, before we run out of time, I want to make sure we spend our requisite time on tech today, because AI has been such a major topic in 2023. And Vishal, it's funny because we could probably have started in January and had almost the exact same conversation around whether it's generative AI specifically or AI and machine learning more generally. And the conversation would have been different every single time we had it. I mean, I'm sure there are things that even change substantially between when people are filling in the survey and now as we're reflecting back on analyzing it. What are some of the latest things that you're seeing around generative AI, Vishal, and how it's starting to work its way materially into the procurement space?
Yeah, I would say it's a pretty exciting time for technology. So generative AI, if we were talking about this in January, we would not be talking about it in the same way as we're going to today.
Yeah.
I think it was even way less understood even in January, right? And as Ivalua, like you talked to me in January, we didn't have a generative AI strategy or product in place. You talked to me today, and we do. So that's I think the rapid pace at which it's moving. But generative AI, often misunderstood as some magic thing. Yeah, it's not magic. It's very much around content creation, content modification, content summarization. It's largely, focused on text, but can do image, video, all sorts of things. And for procurement, I guess, the impact is it can be anywhere you're having to create content. So an RFP is content, right?
Yeah.
An email to suppliers, content. A contract, full of content. A catalog, it's full of product information and content, right? Invoices, content. So all of those things are text and content. And if it's text and content, there is some use and value of generative AI. The thing is that our approach is and has been, and it will be, that we as one technology provider cannot come up with all the hundreds of scenarios that generative AI can possibly add value.
Yeah.
But if we put it in the hands of customers and in the hands of partners like Deloitte, together they can rapidly create many more, hundreds of use cases across source to pay that can, in isolation, they'll save 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour. But when you add all that up, it's going to, I think, create a lot more time for all the strategic aspects we've been talking about, for procurement to focus on those. So when we talk about category managers, and I think the role of the category manager, as you said, Joe, it's going to be someone that is super highly skilled, that can leverage data science, that can, is very well informed on supply markets, is very well, entrenched in supplier relationships. I think that role is going to become much broader, but it's only because they may be able to sort of, not outsource, but, have AI kind of help with all the other little bits of activities that they have to do in communication, in content generation. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Still very early days, but lots of potential there, I think. Yeah.
Well, and I think what's interesting about it, Joe, is that there's sort of two change paths going on at the same time. The technology is maturing and evolving, and the user interface is improving in response to feedback. But we as individuals are also evolving, both in terms of our understanding and also the creativity that we're willing to bring to bear in terms of how we employ it. I mean, I'll be honest, my first couple of tests of generative AI was like, okay, write me a supplier letter that sounds like I'm a pirate, right? I mean, I think we all probably started someplace like that. But then as the humor starts to wear off and you start to think, okay, but if I think about, as Vishal said, an RFP is a form of content, it's changing how we think about our work and how we think about applying tools like AI. What have you observed as you've gone through even the data analysis process from the survey to sort of see some of that change and evolution playing out?
Yeah, it's, Vishal, I loved what you said. Like, it's not magic, but it is amazing. And some of the applications of generative AI are quite honestly, mind-blowing. But what we are seeing, again, continuing the pattern, orchestrators of value, even when the survey was issued, were 16 times more likely to be using some form of AI or significantly investing in it. And, if I had to characterize kind of the state of play right now, what we are seeing, I think, is a lot of testing of use cases without necessarily yet anything, sort of scaling quite yet across the industry as a whole. But I think that's going to move very fast. We see a lot of desire, for example, to utilize generative AI to do things like connecting contracts better to POs, to automate portions of RFX generation, to automate the research that can go into creating category strategies, to even automate portions of negotiations. But it really is, in many cases, at a pretty experimental stage. but moving very fast. And maybe I'll just add that I completely agree with this idea that, in the kind of best possible world, what generative AI is helping to do is to sort of remove some of those highly tactical tasks that, let's be honest, can occupy so much of a sourcing professional's day, and to free up the capacity to be able to do those higher strategy, higher value added roles, with the important caveat that just creating the space is not enough, right? You still have to train, expect, invest in that capability, because just having a vacuum of space is not sufficient to all of a sudden make somebody a highly strategic business partner.
Yeah. And I think that actually, it sort of gives us an indirect, but a really excellent reflection on maybe something that's towards the essence of these orchestrators of value. It's not that, they were in the club and got the letter that, hey, you guys, generative AI is going to be really big. It's that they saw something new and had both the innate curiosity, but also the discipline to set it up for success and create a pilot or put some rigor around it, maybe dedicate somebody's time to it. That if it hadn't been generative AI that was big this year, and instead it was, I don't know, drone delivery, jetpacks, whatever, like other high-tech thing that we wouldn't necessarily know is coming, their way of looking at the world and thinking about the value that they do create would have found a way to bring that in, not necessarily to keep it, but to say, okay, this is starting to make ripples. Let's check this out and see if it has value for us, and discard it if it's not something that's going to benefit the objectives that we're trying to achieve. So to me, not necessarily a data point per se, but I think in spirit, the fact that they clamped onto this potential associated with generative AI so quickly to be, what did you say, 16% more likely to have tested it out in some way beyond my pirate example.
Actually, 16 times more likely.
16 times more likely. Yeah. That's huge. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think we've learned a lot about orchestrators of value, and hopefully everybody that's either joining us live or watching or listening later on sees some piece of themselves or their team in this idea of orchestrators of value, because there's a piece of that in all of us. All we really have to do is kind of figure out what those other pieces are and start to explore them. Joe Chmielewski from Deloitte, Vishal Patel from Ivalua. Thank you both so much for being with me today to talk about the study and what it means for procurement. I really appreciate both of your insights.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And I want to thank everybody as well, both who's joined us live today and also everybody else joining us later on if you find this content on demand. We welcome you to go to artofprocurement.com/calendar and check out other upcoming events that we have. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate everybody being with us, and I look forward to having you join us again at our next live Art of Procurement discussion. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.